Hey there, I'm Jesse at Construx. You probably know me from all the emails that I send on a weekly basis. I'm here with Steve McConnell, author of Code Complete and the new book, More Effective Agile, a roadmap for software leaders. Steve, good to be with you today.
Thanks for having me.
So Steve, there are a lot of books out about Agile right now. Why did you feel that another book was needed? Why this book?
I think there were two main reasons that I thought another Agile book was needed. One was that there was really no book in the market aimed at leaders, and this is a pretty big omission from the literature since it really is important how the Agile implementations are overseen and either supported or not supported by higher level leaders in the organizations. I think the other gap in the literature was I didn't really see any Agile books that focused specifically on practical applications of Agile that dealt with not with trying to implement Agile per se, but just looking at it as a toolbox where we're trying to solve practical problems, and some of the tools may be more applicable. Some of them might not be applicable at all in particular circumstances. And so having a book that really talked about Agile not as an all or nothing proposition or as a movement, but talked about it just more as a practical set of tools seemed like it would be a useful contribution to the literature.
You know, you mentioned the practical aspects of Agile. You've been known as an author who uses practicality in your writing, like Code Complete. How did that inspire you for this book?
It's been really important to me in each book that I've written to try to keep the focus of the book on what is going to be most useful to the reader. In this book, because the audience for the book really is leaders, the focus was really very much on what is going to be most useful to the leader who is reading the book. So the book really isn't aimed at individual contributors, and there are features of the book that are not going to be that useful to individual contributors. One of the key features of the book is at the end of each chapter there is a section on suggested leadership actions. These really are designed to help the leader crystallize the content of the book and then, most important, actually take practical action as a result of what's been discussed in the book.
You mentioned that at the end of each chapter you have that inspect and adapt section that there are suggested tips for leaders to use. And I know that you've added a workbook that's available free on the website to download or can be purchased if somebody wants a physical copy. Can you tell me a little bit about what inspired that? Yeah. Why make that a part of this book?
Yeah, the workbook is an incremental add. It's not really, there's nothing significantly different about it than the book itself. It really just includes the suggested leadership actions with expanded space to take notes. There were some review comments about the manuscript where people had asked for really just more space to take notes. I didn't think it was a good idea to make the book 50 pages longer just to add space to take notes, so we created this workbook which people can download and print, or if they really want to, they can buy a copy online.
Okay. So, Steve, what do you see as the largest area of failure or disappointment in current Agile, in terms of how Agile has been implemented on the ground?
Yeah. I think, unfortunately, there are implementations of Agile where Agile is seen as an end in itself. And so I think the biggest weakness or disappointment that I've seen most often is Agile that loses touch with what the business objectives are for deploying Agile practices in the first place. So one of the things I've tried to emphasize in the book is how to tie Agile practices to desired business outcomes. And Agile actually has lots of really good practices that can provide really strong support for business outcomes. So I think it's unfortunate that some of the implementations lose sight of the businesses that they are intended to serve in the first place.
Steve, your book hardly mentions the Agile Manifesto. What are the reasons for that?
Well, I think it's true that most of the Agile books that you'd read would start with a fairly lengthy explanation of the Agile Manifesto. The Agile Manifesto is almost 20 years old at this point. I think it served a very important purpose as a launching pad 20 years ago to try to get the software development world pried loose from some less than ideal practices related to excessive bureaucracy, excessive documentation, and maybe an overly sequential approach to software development. But that was 20 years ago. I think it served its purpose. It did, in fact, serve as a launching pad. And today I think we're seeing a less healthy use of the Agile Manifesto, which is that when people talk about some new practice, a lot of times in the Agile world, people will take the new practice and, as part of validating the practice, try to trace it back to the Agile Manifesto. And if they can't find some root of the practice in the Agile Manifesto, then in some sense the practice is treated as less than valid. I think this doesn't make any sense at all. If a practice is useful, then it should be used, regardless of whether it can be traced back to the manifesto or not. And so I think whereas originally the manifesto was intended as a launching pad, today it often serves more as a tether that is limiting progress because of this really not very healthy need to trace practices back to some origin in the manifesto. And I think we see some fairly unhealthy dynamics around that. One is practices are getting dismissed outright because they're treated as not agile or can't be found in the manifesto. The other is that we find ourselves sometimes engaged in this kind of crazy agile hermeneutics where people are taking practices and then trying to reinterpret the words in the manifesto to somehow support this practice that really doesn't have any basis in the manifesto, but is nevertheless a good practice. And as I said, the basis for evaluating practice really ought to be, does it serve a useful technical or business purpose? And if so, then let's use it. And if it doesn't, then let's not use it. And in a large sense, whether it can be traced back to the manifesto is not really relevant.
So Steve, what is your greatest hope for More Effective Agile?
My greatest hope for More Effective Agile is that it gets people pried loose from the thinking that Agile is an all or nothing proposition and helps them to start seeing Agile as a set of tools in a toolbox or a set of practices that can help them achieve business and practical ends. And I think that that's a big part of what is needed to truly move toward more effective Agile. The idea that we're going to take Agile as an all or nothing proposition, regardless of what the actual needs of the business are, just, again, doesn't really make sense. And so if we can get people focused first on what does the business really need, and then second, how can Agile support the needs of the business, then I will have met my objective for writing More Effective Agile.
Steve, what's the first thing in the book that you think will surprise people?
Well, I think the first thing that will really surprise people is probably on page 2 of the book, which is a star chart that shows the average Scrum team performance versus a healthy Scrum team performance. And what we've seen is that the average Scrum team performance is pretty far from the healthy Scrum team performance. What I think is really going to surprise people about that is they're going to reflect on the experience with their own Scrum teams, and it's actually going to line up with their experience. And so I think what they're going to be surprised about is that their experience actually is the same thing that's going on in the rest of the industry.
What's the first part in the book where you really depart from conventional wisdom in Agile?
I would say it's the discussion of the Agile Boundary, the idea that an organization can have part of the organization that is using Agile practice and part that is not using Agile practice. Conventional wisdom for Agile consultants really is that it's an all or nothing proposition. You have to convert your entire organization to be Agile, or you might as well not do it at all. That has not been my company's experience. In my company's experience, you can get significant value from having even one team adopt Scrum, but the value will be limited to that one team. Of course, it's going to work better if you have multiple teams adopting Agile practices, but you can still get benefit from partial adoptions. And so the reality is that in businesses, you may not be able to convince other parts of the business to adopt Agile practices, but that doesn't mean that the engineering organization shouldn't adopt Agile practices. And even if the entire business adopts Agile practices, that doesn't mean that your customers will adopt Agile practices or your suppliers will. So the idea of drawing the Agile boundary is just being explicit and accepting the reality rather than pretending it doesn't exist, that in most cases there's going to be part of the business that's Agile and part of the business that's not Agile, and having some sort of well thought out way of handling that boundary actually helps both the Agile and the non-Agile parts of the business.
I know we've discussed that that was part of the book that stood out to a lot of reviewers. Why do you think that was?
I think that reviewers are aware that that's an issue, and they've tried to wrestle with that issue in their own organizations, but there's been this undercurrent in a lot of the Agile literature that in some way that's unseemly or not acceptable. And I think that's really unfortunate subtext to the Agile messaging. And so I think what people liked about it was it gives overt permission for something that's really just a common sense idea, that if the ground truth in your organization is that you're not going to be able to get Agile adopted 100% end-to-end in all aspects of your organization, it makes sense to just put on the table, well, where can we do it and where can't we, and what does that imply about what we need to do in the areas that we can do it.
Steve, you have one chapter called What's Really Different About Agile. What's the most important point in this chapter for a senior leader?
In that chapter in the book, I'm beginning to introduce the idea that the world, it consists of different kinds of problems, and some of those problems are what I describe in the book as complicated and can be approached in a pretty linear and sequential way. And other problems are what I call complex, and those really cannot be approached in a linear and sequential way. For complex problems, we actually have to do some experimentation or probing and see what happens. And so I think for a senior leader, the important point to take away from that introductory content is really just the idea that in the software world, it's not always possible to make a plan on day one and then follow the plan through to the end of the project. Sometimes the plan has to be, we're going to experiment, we're going to learn from our experiments, and we're going to adapt as we go.
Steve, why is it important for teams, companies, and leaders to understand the chapter on responding to the challenges of complexity and uncertainty?
That's the chapter where I first really introduced the concept of inspect and adapt. And inspect and adapt really runs all the way through the book. The suggested leadership actions are based on the organization of inspect and adapt. And I think this is an area where Agile implementations, and for that matter, advice about Agile implementations often falls short. One of the less healthy aspects that we see in Agile discussions is the idea of doing Agile correctly. Well, the idea of doing Agile correctly sort of implies that there's a static version of Agile, and if we can just get that correct, then we'll be doing Agile well. Inspect and adapt really gets across the idea that Agile is much more about being dynamic. It's about paying attention to what's going on, observing how it's working, and then adapting to make it work better. So this notion of there being a correct implementation of Agile doesn't even make sense. So really, I think the most important takeaway in that chapter is literally the inspect and adapt part, where we want people paying attention to what's going on, learning from experience, and then getting better based on that inspect and adapt cycle.
The whole thing seems to be just getting better to me.
I think an interesting thread in the reviewer comments about that was there being a little bit of a tension between the idea of continuous improvement, which is a typical management phrase, versus the idea of sustainable pace. And I had quite a few leaders talk about the fact that a relentless focus on continuous improvement can actually lead to burnout in their teams. And I think that's interesting. I think that depends somewhat on the personalities of the people on the teams. But one of the shifts that I made in the manuscript based on that feedback was the idea that if you put the focus on continuous learning rather than on continuous improvement, that doesn't seem to be as fatiguing, but it really results in the same end. And so what wasn't in the initial version of the manuscript was that idea of continuous learning, but what's there in the final book really is that as more of an emphasis than on continuous improvement.
In Chapter 4, you talk about Scrum. Where do teams most often fall down when it comes to Scrum?
Scrum is really designed as a minimal process. I think that's part of why Scrum has been so successful is it really meets that guideline that something is complete, not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing more to take away. And so we've seen a lot of partial implementations of Scrum where the team is just not getting the mileage that they could be getting because they're not really implementing Scrum with very much fidelity. You know, an awful lot of software practices, I would apply the 80-20 rule. I'm a big 80-20 guy where I think if you can apply 20% of the effort and get 80% of the benefit, that applies in a lot of cases. I don't think that's the case with Scrum. I think Scrum is already minimal enough that you really have to do all of it to get 100% of the benefit. And so what we see teams doing 80% of the work and getting 20% of the benefit. It really is the opposite of the 80-20 rule. The great thing, though, is that if you do apply Scrum, it is a minimal process to begin with. And so once you get those minimal practices in place, then you're really in a position to start getting significant benefit.
Do these teams that are using Scrum or what they call Scrum think that they're getting all the benefits out of it, or is it something that they just don't know what they don't know?
I think that's a great question. I think that for a lot of teams, the starting point is a great deal of pain and very ineffective practices. And so it really is true that they might get some benefit that's better than where they were from using even selected pieces of Scrum. And I think what happens is they just don't know how much better life could be if they were implementing Scrum more faithfully.
So you've said earlier that Agile's kind of a toolbox where you can pick and choose, but here it seems like you're saying a little bit of the opposite. Do you want to explain a little bit more?
I can see why it would seem like I'm saying the opposite, because I really am saying that Scrum is a practice that you want to start by implementing the whole thing. Scrum is really well thought out, and I view Scrum as the practice. And so when I say you can pick and choose Agile practices, I think that it treats Scrum essentially as an atomic practice, meaning indivisible practice. I would say that adapting Scrum is really more of an expert activity. And so if you're a beginner, you really want to adopt it by the book. And what we see is a lot of beginners starting at the advanced mode, where they're adapting it before they've even tried the basic full version of it. It might, in fact, make sense to adapt Scrum at some point. And that's part of that whole inspect and adapt idea, is if you get far enough down the road and get enough expertise using Scrum, you should at some point be applying inspect and adapt and customizing it to your needs. But the way that you customize it is by collecting observations about what's working well and what's not working well. Agile is really intended to have a strong empirical focus, so really taking that empirical approach. And then when you do adapt it, you're adapting not on the basis of a bunch of people sitting in a room and saying, oh, we don't think that's going to work here, but on the basis of actual experience where you've observed whether things are working or whether they're not.
Steve, we're talking about Agile team culture. How is somebody going to summarize this for a leader who may not read your book?
One of the interesting things about Agile is that a key part of Agile is putting accountability at the team level. The main unit of productivity for an Agile project is the team, not the individual. And I think senior leaders tend to naturally be focused on individuals as the unit of productivity. But Agile, really, accountability stops at the team. And from a business point of view, it doesn't really matter. We need something or someone to be accountable. We need to know who we can go talk to, who's going to report status, who is going to commit to achieving business results, and so on. And it's not really that much of a shift, I think, to say that it's the team that's accountable rather than the individuals. But it enables a lot of Agile practices if we can get senior leaders to understand that accountability really does shift to the team. And then that opens up possibilities like the team becoming more self-managing. It opens up possibilities for the managers to then go do other activities that they don't really need to do anymore because the team is doing those activities. Now, it takes a while to get to that point. You can't just wave a magic wand and on day number 1 and expect the team to be fully self-managing on day number 2. But one of the strengths of Agile is that we can get to the point where the teams become self-managing. And then there's some motivation and morale that goes along with the teams becoming self-managing. There's also some efficiency that goes with that because we can shorten the feedback loop when the team starts making more decisions internally within the team and doesn't have to go out and get as much information from outside the team as it might have in the days before teams were organized in that way.
In the acknowledgments of the book, you talk about reaching out to people when there were chapters that you wanted to expand upon. One is the OODA information. Do you want to talk about that process a little bit?
Yeah, the thing about review that was really cool is I get people who are super passionate and super knowledgeable about topics, and the book is really about breadth more than about depth. But so for the OODA chapter, OODA originated with Air Force pilot, or I'm not sure it was Air Force pilot or Marine pilot, Colonel John Boyd. And so this is now part of U.S. fighter pilot training. So for the review of that chapter, I actually had a fighter pilot who gave me really good input on OODA and how to explain OODA. And this is from a person who has lived this in the environment that it was created in. And so, we're trying to adapt that concept to software, but he gave me some really good suggestions about how to explain it. And obviously, I think the chapter is stronger for that.
Yeah. Sometimes we joke in the office about this being the most well-reviewed Agile book in the world because of the number of reviewers. Tell me a little bit about how that was compared with your last books.
Yeah. Uh, the review process for this book got a little bit out of hand. I ended up getting comments from more than 300 reviewers. There were somewhere between 10 and 15,000 comments. It was a lot of work to go through all the review comments, but it was also super valuable to the book, and it was educational for me personally. I think the really cool thing about peer review for a book like this is that people don't really comment on the things they don't care about. They comment on the things that they care about, that they know a lot about, that they're passionate about. And so really and I get to be the center of that. I get to hear people who have had a lot of experience with distributed teams and have developed some insights that you may not read about anywhere else, but they give me all those comments in their peer review comments. I get somebody who is really knowledgeable about OODA, who has lived it, and so I get to be the recipient of those comments. So really, in a lot of ways, I was the beneficiary of these people's strongest passion and their best thinking, and then I got to flow that into the book. And so I think the final book really is immeasurably better than the draft that I sent to reviewers because of all these very generous review comments.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things about having as extensive a review process as I had was that there were lots of reviewers who would comment on the exact same topic, but they ended up having different perspectives on that topic. So for example, I got a large number of comments on daily stand-ups in Scrum and how to run those effectively, but they weren't all the same. And so there were some people who were very passionately say, we don't use the 3 questions anymore. Or they would very passionately say, these are the wrong 3 questions. We use these 3 questions instead. And so I probably had 5 or 10 different versions of people who said, these are the exact right way to word the 3 questions. But it wasn't the same wording from all these people. It was 5 or 10 different wordings of the 3 questions. And so to me, that's really interesting because these are smart people. They're reporting their own experience. They're being very consistent with the idea that Agile is supposed to be an empirical paradigm, and they're giving me the results of their own experience, but their experience doesn't match each other's experience. So as a consultant and author, what that forces me to do is to say, all right, how is it possible that 5 or 10 different people can have been paying close attention to their own experience but come to somewhat different conclusions? And so I end up distilling that in a certain way in the book. In terms of the 3 questions, the way I distilled it was by saying, what it really looks like to me is that because the daily stand-ups happen every day, it supports a really quick inspect and adapt loop where teams get practice every single day asking and answering the 3 questions, and teams are able to iterate pretty quickly toward a solution that works for them. But of course, different teams have different people on the teams, and so the version of the 3 questions that works for one team may not be the best version of the questions that works for another team. And really, at its heart, this is what Agile is supposed to be all about. It's about each team paying attention, learning from its own experience, inspecting and adapting. And really, it shouldn't be that surprising that different teams are going to come to different answers about what works best for them.
Mm-hmm. So how do you think Agile purists are going to react to More Effective Agile?
I think there are Agile purists, and I think one of the darker aspects of Agile is the idea that Agile has become in some circles almost like a loyalty test, and where, are you really Agile? And we see all kinds of articles and tweets about how to tell whether someone is really Agile and how to tell whether your team is really Agile. This whole school of thought of really Agile feels to me like loyalty tests from the McCarthy era. I don't think it really matters whether some project, team, or organization is really Agile. What matters is, are they using practices that are effective for their particular business needs? And I think the way that I hope that Agile purists, so-called, react to the book is I hope that the book helps them see that businesses don't really care whether they're Agile or not. They care whether their business is operating effectively. They care whether software teams are supporting the needs of the business in a way that's transparent, predictable, understandable, cooperative, effective. And so what I hope Agile purists see is that Agile is a means to an end. It is not the end. And so the question of, is it really Agile, treats the term Agile as though it's the end, not the means. And so I would hope that Agile purists can start to see that the real question is, are you using the appropriate set of practices that your business needs? Agile over the years has become an enormous umbrella that covers countless practices and sets of principles and versions of manifestos and individual practices and philosophies. And so the idea that something either is or isn't Agile doesn't even really make sense for such a huge umbrella of topics. But what that huge umbrella of topics does suggest is that today we really have a wealth of practices that can support all kinds of different business needs. And so whether the business needs predictability or whether it needs flexibility, whether it needs to shorten time to market, whether it needs to release more often, whether it needs to improve quality, Agile practices exist that support all of these different objectives, but it's not the same set of practices for every scenario.
Steve, you didn't invent a lot of the concepts that are in this book. Why should somebody follow this book as opposed to following somebody that did invent Agile?
Well, I'd go even further than that and say I didn't invent any of the concepts in the book, really. But I think a lot of the times the person who ends up best explaining something is not necessarily the person who invented the ideas in the first place. And the people who created the Agile Manifesto did the industry a big service 20 years ago in getting us pried loose from overly dogmatic approaches to sequential development and supporting some investigation into more iterative and exploratory development approaches, which are a better fit for a lot of software development problems. I think the problem with inventing something is that sometimes you get overly locked into your own invention, and it can become hard to move beyond that initial invention. And I think that in practice, in the companies we've worked with over the last 15 years especially, we have seen companies that have moved beyond the ideas in the original Agile Manifesto and to some degree moved beyond the principles that were stated at the same time. And I think what I see in the literature is that the people who invented these concepts are still, in my mind, overly tied to that good work that was done 20 years ago, but that we now have the opportunity and in some sense the obligation to move beyond. And the way we move beyond that is not by engaging in endless hermeneutics about whether something is really Agile or not, or about whether an idea can be traced back and somehow found in some interpretation of the Agile Manifesto. The way we move beyond is to realize that the manifesto is a launching pad. It's back there, it served a useful purpose, but now we look at new ideas and realize we're quite a few steps down the road from that. And I think this book presents an opportunity for people to say, yeah, that was great 15 years ago, but now we have a set of practices where some of those practices have fallen by the wayside, other practices have really emerged that are useful, and in some interesting cases, I think, we've had a pendulum that swung over to the Agile side, maybe too far, but now it's actually swung back to a really interesting merger of concepts that incorporate the best of both Agile ideas and sequential ideas that are actually better than either Agile or sequential on their own. And I talk about some of those practices in the book.
So, Steve, out of all the chapters in the book, which one is your personal favorite?
Well, my favorite chapter in the book actually isn't really in the book. I really like this topic of predictability and estimation, and it's been frustrating to me for a long time that there's all this Agile machinery that actually provides really good support for predictability and estimation, and a lot of teams don't use it, and part they don't use it because there's a perception that it's not really Agile. So I wrote a pretty long chapter for the reviewer edition that went into a lot of detail about supporting predictability on Agile projects. And I got some really, really helpful feedback from reviewers that basically said, Steve, I know you really like the estimation topic, and I know that you know as much as, there aren't very many people in the world who know more about this topic than you do, but this is the longest chapter in the book. It's really technical. It goes into a lot of detail. It kind of seems like it's mismatched with the rest of the book. So in the final edition of the book, the chapter is much abbreviated, much more consistent with the treatments in the rest of the book. So there's a sense in which my favorite chapter didn't make it into the book.
So, Steve, you weren't at the Snowbird conference. You didn't invent Agile. Why should people read your book and follow what it says?
I think the book itself is an empirical exercise. This is not a book about what I read somewhere. I mean, there's lots of research, and I give citations so people can go read more if they want to. But this is primarily a book about what my company and I have observed directly with companies that we have worked with. So the book itself is intended to be an example of the Agile focus on empiricism, that is, paying attention to what works on the ground. Since I didn't invent any of these practices, I don't have any particular axe to grind in terms of wanting one practice to work or not work. It really is just more an observation of what have we seen actually working. And the software industry is full of great ideas that seem like they should work, but that don't actually work that well. And so being a little bit dispassionate or a little bit detached in terms of being willing to look at certain practices and saying, this seemed like a good idea, but it didn't actually work, I think that's actually a strength of the book, in that I think I'm able to be pretty objective in saying what we've seen work and what we haven't.
Well, thanks for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. Let us know what you think. If you haven't read the book, we hope that you'll go out and read it, share it with your friends. If you have, we've got a bunch of other resources on the website that are available to download, including the brand new workbook that you can download free as a PDF. And lastly, sign up for our email list so that you get notified of all the great stuff that we're continually coming out with.